The world does not crush you when you are poor. It crushes you when you are weak. Most people spend their entire lives building a kingdom of glass, only to watch it shatter with a single stone of betrayal. But what if the moment you lose everything is the exact moment you become dangerous? This is the story of Alexander, a man who once had it all. 5 years ago, he was the man everyone wanted to be. He had $1 million empire, a reputation that commanded respect, and a woman named Sarah, the person he thought would stand by him forever. He was at the peak of his life, blinded by the bright lights of success. But success has a way of making you comfortable, and comfort is the greatest enemy of a warrior. In just 6 months, his world turned to ash. His business partner, a man he called his brother, drained every cent from their accounts and vanished into the shadows. The legal battles stripped him of his home. The luxury cars were towed away. But the deepest wound was yet to come. Sarah, the woman who promised to love him through thick and thin, did not offer a hand to pull him up. Instead, she looked at his empty pockets and walked away. Her last words were a poison that stayed in his blood. "You were never a king, Alexander. You were just a man, wearing a crown of luck. And now, you are just a loser." One rainy Tuesday, Alexander stood on the edge of the Blackwood Bridge. The cold wind bit through his thin jacket, but the cold inside his chest was worse. He looked down at the dark, rushing water. He felt like a ghost in a city that had already forgotten his name. He took a step toward the edge. He was ready to let the river end the noise in his head. "If you jump now, you are only proving her right." A voice, cold and steady as a mountain, cut through the rain. Alexander turned to see an old man leaning against the railing. His name was Arthur. He did not look like a savior. He looked like a man who had survived 1,000 storms and learned how to command the wind. "I have nothing left," Alexander whispered, his voice breaking. "I am empty." Arthur smiled slightly. "Empty? No, Alexander. You are finally free. Only a man with nothing left to lose is capable of doing things no one else dares to do. You can die today as a victim, or you can die 6 months from now as a legend. The choice is yours." Alexander had nothing to lose, so he followed the old man. Arthur took him far away from the city to a desolate island where the maps ended and the wild began. There were no phones, no internet, and no voices, only the crashing of waves against jagged rocks. On the first morning, Arthur gave him a wooden staff and a simple command. "For the next 180 days, you will follow the architect's code. And the first rule is the hardest, the law of zero interaction. From this moment on, you will not speak, not to me, not to yourself, and certainly not to the world you left behind. Every word you speak is a leak in your power," Arthur continued. "You spent your life explaining yourself to people who did not care. Now, you will learn to build in silence. When your tongue stops moving, your mind begins to see." The first 30 days were a living hell. His mind screamed for the noise of the city. He wanted to curse the partner who robbed him. He wanted to beg Sarah for another chance, but Alexander remained silent. He spent his days carrying heavy stones up the cliffs and his nights staring into the fire. As the weeks passed, something strange happened. The anger did not go away. It transformed. It became a cold, focused energy. Without the distraction of talking, Alexander began to notice things he had never seen before. The strength in his own muscles, the patterns of the tides, and the absolute weakness of his past self. He realized he had not lost his business because of bad luck. He lost it because he was addicted to the validation of others. He was a slave to his ego. Now, in the silence, he was becoming his own master. One evening, while Arthur was away, Alexander found an old leather-bound diary hidden under a floorboard in the cabin. He opened it, and his eyes widened. Inside were strategies, names, and a history of a man who had once destroyed entire industries to build a hidden empire. Arthur was not just a teacher. He was the world's most feared strategist who had gone into hiding. And then, Alexander saw a name in the diary that made his blood run cold. It was the name of the man who had betrayed him. The lesson was no longer just about survival. It was about to become about a calculated, silent revenge. Alexander was no longer a victim. He was becoming the silent architect. But was he ready for the secrets Arthur was still hiding? Stay tuned for Part 2. The Art of Emotional Decoupling. The air in the cabin grew heavy as Alexander stared at the name written in the old leather-bound diary. It was Marcus, the man who had stolen his company, his wealth, and his dignity. The silence he had practiced for 60 days was suddenly threatened by a roar of rage inside his chest. He wanted to scream. He wanted to leave the island that very second and hunt Marcus down. But as he turned toward the door, Arthur was already there, leaning against the frame, his eyes as cold as the morning mist. Arthur did not ask why the diary was open. He simply walked toward the fire and sat down. "You found the name," Arthur said quietly. "Now you have a choice. You can go back now and let your anger guide you, and I guarantee you will lose again. Marcus did not just beat you with money. He beat you because he knew how to play with your emotions. If you go back as a man who feels, you will go back as a victim." Alexander's hands trembled. He wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the law of silence held his tongue. Arthur looked at him with a piercing gaze. "Put the diary away. To defeat a predator, you must first stop being the prey." Today, we begin the second lesson, the art of emotional decoupling. This is the secret of the powerful. Most people are like puppets. Their strings are pulled by insults, praise, and fear. To be truly dangerous, you must cut those strings. You must become a ghost in your own story. The next 90 days were harder than anything Alexander had ever experienced. Arthur didn't just push his body, he pushed his mind to the breaking point. He would wake Alexander up in the middle of the night and force him to stand in the freezing ocean waves while whispering the insults Sarah had said to him. He would describe Marcus's success, his new cars, and his laughter. At first, Alexander would shake with fury, but every time he reacted, Arthur would make him stay in the water longer. Slowly, the shift began. Alexander realized that anger was just energy being wasted. He stopped seeing Marcus as a villain and started seeing him as a variable in a mathematical equation. He stopped seeing Sarah as a lost love and started seeing her as a lesson in misplaced trust. His heart didn't get colder. It got quieter. He was learning to separate his actions from his feelings. He was becoming a man who could walk through a storm without getting wet. Arthur began teaching him the language of the elite, not the language of words, but the language of leverage, psychology, and hidden movements. They spent hours over a chessboard, but they weren't playing chess. They were simulating the destruction of empires. Arthur showed him how to find a man's greatest strength and turn it into his greatest weakness. He taught him that the loudest person in the room is usually the weakest, and the one who says nothing is the one who controls the outcome. By the end of the 5th month, Alexander's physical transformation was complete. His eyes were no longer filled with the desperation of a broken man. They were calm, deep, and terrifyingly focused. He no longer needed the diary to remember Marcus's name. He had memorized every move Marcus would make before Marcus even knew he was going to make it. He was no longer a businessman. He was a strategist. One morning, Arthur handed Alexander a clean suit and a plane ticket. The 180 days were over. "You are ready," Arthur said. "But remember this, revenge is a dish that is best served without emotion. If you feel joy when he falls, you are still his slave. If you feel nothing, you are his master." Alexander took the ticket and looked at the old man one last time. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. He simply nodded and walked toward the boat. The silent architect was returning to the city that had chewed him up and spat him out. But this time, the city wouldn't even see him coming. He wasn't going back to get his money. He was going back to take everything. As the boat pulled away from the island, Alexander looked at his reflection in the water. The man who had stood on the bridge ready to jump was dead. The man standing on the boat was a ghost who was about to haunt an entire industry. The city was exactly as Alexander had left it, loud, arrogant, and blinded by its own lights. But Alexander was not the same man who had stood broken on the Blackwood Bridge. He moved like a shadow through the streets, where he once begged for a second chance. He did not go to Marcus's office with a gun or a loud shout. He went to a small, dusty basement and began to move the invisible strings Arthur had taught him to pull. Marcus was at the peak of his power. He had just announced the biggest merger in the industry, a deal that would make him the most powerful man in the city. He stood in front of the cameras, flashing the same smile he had used to deceive Alexander. He felt untouchable, but what Marcus didn't know was that a ghost was already in the room. Alexander had spent the last 2 weeks quietly buying up the debts that Marcus's company had hidden. He wasn't attacking Marcus's bank account. He was attacking his foundation. The night of the merger gala was the grandest event of the year. Sarah was there, draped in diamonds, standing by Marcus's side. They were the golden couple of the city. As the champagne flowed and the music played, Marcus walked to the stage to sign the final papers. But just as the pen touched the paper, the giant screens behind him flickered and changed. They didn't show the company's logo. They showed the private transcripts of Marcus's illegal bank transfers, the evidence of his betrayal, and the names of every person he had stepped on to get to the top. The room went silent. The cameras, once focused on Marcus's smile, now captured his panic. In that moment of chaos, the back doors of the hall opened. Alexander walked in. He wasn't wearing a crown, and he didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He walked straight to the front of the room. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes wide with shock and a sudden, desperate hope for a second chance. She tried to speak, to say his name, but Alexander walked past her as if she were made of glass. He didn't even look at her. To him, she was no longer a person. She was just a memory of a man who no longer existed. Alexander stood face to face with Marcus. Marcus was shaking, his face pale, his empire crumbling in front of millions of people. He looked at Alexander and whispered, "How? How did you do this?" Alexander leaned in, and for the first time in 6 months, he broke his silence. He whispered only 4 words. "I built this silence." Within an hour, Marcus was being led away in handcuffs. The merger was dead. The company was in ruins. Alexander walked out of the gala and back into the cool night air. He didn't go to take back his office. He didn't go to claim the money. He walked to the Blackwood Bridge, the place where his old life had almost ended. He looked at the water, but he didn't see a victim anymore. He saw a man who had mastered his own mind. He took the old leather-bound diary and dropped it into the river. He didn't need the lessons anymore. He had become the lesson. Success is not about the money you make or the people you defeat. True power is the ability to stand in the middle of a storm and feel nothing but peace. Alexander didn't return to the city to be a king. He returned to prove that once you master your silence, no one can ever take your voice again. The architect had finished his masterpiece. The story of Alexander was over, but the legend of the silent architect was just beginning.